how much draft he had set. He'd have to determine about when he thought the sawdust would run out so he could get up and refill the hopper at that time. It might be interesting to note at this point that somewhere along about 1935, a partition was built in the large greenhouse, which was about a third of the way out from the shed. And separate pipes were run. These were installed by George Corfield White to heat that back part of the greenhouse separately from the rest, so that if necessary or if desirable, just that part of the greenhouse could be heated and the rest of it could go without heating. This would be for milder weather, or in really cold weather the back part could be heated in addition to what the main furnace was doing. And to heat it, we purchased a small sawdust burner with a small hopper and just a small scale version of the big one, but it was only a tenth the size. It meant it had to have a separate tank reservoir for water, since it was a hot water system in both cases. And there was just room in the basement for this extra sawdust burner. Now, getting back up to Jessup Street and my mother, it seems that my grandfather had some friends who lived on Sovey Island called the Hall, by the name of the Halls. And it was on a trip to the Halls to visit them that he took my mother and me, again in the little, well, maybe by then he had the Franklin. I guess he had the Franklin by that time, because one of the things that my Uncle Glenn did before he was killed was to talk my grandfather into getting a more genteel looking car than that Model A Roadster, or not Roadster, but Model A Coupe. He got him to get a Franklin, large green Franklin Coupe, which had a fake radiator on the front and looked just as important as a Pierce Arrow. So we must have gone to Sovey Island in the Franklin. And while there, my mother, who was still quite distraught over the loss of her brother, met a farmhand there whose name was Glenn Bennett. They took an instant liking to each other, and before we left, Glenn had the address of where we lived in Portland. And the next thing I knew, he was in visiting my mother. So begins a new chapter in this biography. Shortly before this, my grandfather took in a housekeeper by the name of Avril Peel. She was really more than a housekeeper. She was a very special patient, special enough that, in fact, that she and my grandfather were married in Stevenson, Washington, and she became the lady of the house. Since Glenn Bennett's vocation was milking cows, he got a job with Fairview Farms in Fairview, Oregon, in that capacity. This meant that we needed to find a house to rent somewhere in the area, and the nearest thing we could find was a rental house down in Troutdale, Oregon, down by the Sandy River. This was a rental house situated in the Advent Christian Church campground, and it was the only house on in the property except for the caretaker's house, so it was rather unique. It had been built by a member of the congregation, and then he decided later not to live in it. That donated it to the church, and the church used it as rental property. This meant that, except for about 10 days during the summertime when the campground was in use by the church, it was vacant, and we had complete run of the whole area, except, of course, for the caretaker. It was a very pleasant location, and the only thing on the property, except for our house, was different buildings that were used for dormitories and for tent houses when the conference was in session. Also meant that we had use of the men's restroom as our own personal restroom all the rest of the year. The restroom had running water by virtue of a large water tank which was right behind the restroom. Provided water for both the men's and the women's restrooms. It was pretty cold to get up in the middle of the night to go out to use that facility in the wintertime, but it was certainly better than an outhouse. I started 7th grade in that fall of 1937, and went to school at Troutdale grade school, and that was clear up on top of the hill, which meant about a 1-mile walk up the side of the hill to get to school. I had sold my bicycle before I left Portland, and there was no way to use it to go to school anyway, up that side of that hill, almost like the side of a mountain. When we first arrived at the campground, we found that the lady and her 2 sons, 2 high school age sons, who were living in the house, had not vacated it and wouldn't be doing so for 2 or 3 days. And that meant that we had to take up residence in the tent house next door. Remember, the tent house had a funny little wood stove in it with bricks under one corner because a leg was missing. And my mother tried to cook on this contraption during those days while we were waiting for the people to leave the house. I remember another thing, and that was that they had some chickens, but the chickens roosted in the trees, and the only way they could catch the chickens was at night when the chickens had gone to roost. They climb up the ladder and throw a burlap sack over the chickens, pull them down off the limb of the tree. I thought that was a pretty poor way to keep chickens. Well, we finally moved into the house, and right away had to order a stove. Ordered a new stove from Montgomery Ward. It was a wood-fired stove, and of course that meant gathering wood too. And at first there was no woodshed, so the wood was just outdoors. And we got the church to pay for the lumber and build a woodshed behind the restroom. It had wood sides, but the wood didn't come together in the joins. It meant that the wind could blow right through. Kept the rain off, but as Glenn said, if you buy green wood, which we had to buy the first winter, then the woodshed being built the way it was let the wind blow through and dry the wood. And he was right. Going into the woodshed to split the wood wasn't much protection from the wind. It was my job to split the wood and then carry it onto the porch, which is about 50 feet away. Stack it in the places built for wood on the back porch. Another thing we had to buy right away was a washing machine. This was kept on the back porch, and water for it was heated in a reservoir in the wood stove by keeping a fire in the wood stove for a period of time. This would heat the water, and then it could be dipped out with a kettle and carried out onto the porch and dumped into the laundry tubs and into the washing machine. Laundry tubs were for rinsing the clothes. Of course, the washing machine had a wringer. Glenn put up clotheslines outdoors between the trees, and this was a fine place to dry clothes, especially when the east wind blew, which was a good share of the time, especially in the winter. The clothes would blow hard because they froze first, and then as they whipped in the wind, they gradually dried. You'd go out and feel the clothes to see if they were dry. If they were still stiff, why, you knew they weren't dry yet. That first winter, the heater we had was a little, what was called an airtight heater, made of just sheet metal, and you had to be very careful when you build a fire in it that it didn't overheat. If it did, it would turn cherry red and be quite a danger to anything near it that was flammable. The house was built so that as you entered, usually from the back porch, you went into the kitchen, and then if you walked through the kitchen, you were in the living room. There was a front door that came into the living room, which we seldom used. And then off to the right, off the living room, was one bedroom, and off the kitchen was the other bedroom. In between was a closet, in between the two bedrooms, and a ladder going to the upstairs. Half of the upstairs was unfinished, with just a piece of plywood lying over the floor joists to allow storage of whatever various things were not being used right away. The other direction, the other end of the upstairs was a bedroom which was finished. And we found that there was a bedstead with kind of stretched springs built into it, and that was my bedroom. That was where I slept. And in order to make a mattress, we got pieces of burlap and stuffed it with straw, made a straw tick. This was my mattress. It was all right, not bad at all in the summertime, but it wasn't very warm in the winter. Up in that gabled room. That next summer, we went down by the river to gather wood for the stove. The river was about 300 feet across the campus from us. We were at the far edge of the campus. And our transportation at that time was an old 1928 Buick sedan. And by taking the back seat out of it, Glenn had a way of hauling wood. And there was a road that went down onto the rocks, down onto the river rocks. And the reason for going down onto the river rocks with the Buick was to drive across to what was the island. And on the island, there was wood that was caught in the wintertime. Quite a lot of wood. And by taking a crosscut saw and an axe and a wedge, we were able to gather wood for the coming wintertime instead of having to buy it. So we spent quite a lot of time in the summertime cutting wood, filling the woodshed with that extra dry wood. Then when Glenn needed any work done on the car, he'd drive out to the highway, and almost directly across from the entrance to the campground was the entrance to a service station and garage. And this was operated by the Espinels. Al Espinel didn't like to work on old cars like that, but being kind of a friendly guy, he was willing to do what he could to patch it up, get it to running again. Al and Anita, his wife, had 3 boys. There was Wayne and Don, who were about my age. I don't remember the older boy's name. He was in high school. But Don and Wayne and I played together a lot. They would come to our place, or I would go to their place, and we played by the hour. Summertime was a wonderful, lazy time. There wasn't much wood to worry about getting for the stove. So once I'd split the wood and hauled it up onto the porch, that was about all I had to do in the way of chores. One thing I was pretty handy at was making root beer. I'd get out the old canner kettle and talk my mother out of the sugar and put in the root beer extract and the water, and that was all that I needed. I had a capper and some bottles. Don't remember where the bottles came from, but we seemed to have what we needed somehow. And I'd stir up that root beer and put it in the bottles and cap it, and then I'd store it. Took about a week to work before it began to get fizzy. And then I had to store it in the ground. We had no refrigerator, so I dig a hole in the sand, which was the ground that we had. Dig a hole in the sand and put it down there in that hole and covered it with a board. And that kept it pretty cool. When I was ready to drink, it was always easy to find friends to help me get rid of it. We boys always played on or near the river during the summertime. And we built canoes out of logs with an outrigger. One time we found an old scow that we borrowed from the Sand and Gravel Company, is where we found it, and took it out on the river. We pulled it quite a way up the river, going up one side of the river where we could reach with poles. That was quite a trip that day. Got up to where we got tired and let it drift back down. We returned it where we got it. So that we didn't get into any trouble. Troutdale being right at the end of the Columbia River Gorge, where the gorge opened out, was wind country, and especially in the winter, it really got cold, that east wind blowing. It was fun for us kids because it would freeze the water in the backwater of the river, and that meant we could go sliding on the ice. We didn't own any ice skates, so we could go down there and slide on our shoes and have a great time. Also, we found some pieces of corrugated iron, that roofing material, that we could make a toboggan of and slide down the slopes over at the Sand and Gravel Company. And that was fun too. Something my mother talked me into doing several times was to walk to where Glenn was working at Fairview Farms. He was taking care of milking the cows. They were using milking machines at that time, but they had to have someone to handle the machines and clean the cows' udders and clean out the barn afterward. So that was the job that he was doing. My mother would talk me into walking the 3 miles to Fairview Farms and riding back with Glenn. I guess he appreciated the company on the ride back, but I wasn't much help when I got there to help him. All I could do was watch him or go play in the huge hayloft. Now there was another man working, doing the same work that Glenn was doing with some other strings of cows, whose name was Jess Grinnell. And my folks became well acquainted with them through the years, Jess and Etta Grinnell. They had 2 sons. Wayne and Keith. Now, Keith was in my room at school. Wayne was quite a bit older. Sometimes Keith would be there, and I'd have a buddy to play in the hayloft with. That was a cold walk from all the way down at the river, up the hill, and along that highway to get to Fairview Farms. I didn't look forward to it. but it was something to do. When we played in the hayloft, we'd climb up on the top of the bales of hay, and then we'd say, "I'm no chicken, I'm no chicken, I'm no chicken," and jump off into the hay down below. It was probably 20 feet, so it was quite a thrill for us. We were glad to see the end of school come at the end of 7th grade and 8th grade, because it meant that the whole class could go to Jansen Beach Amusement Park. At that time, Jansen Beach had an amusement park much like Oaks Park is now. Oaks Park was there too, but Jansen Beach was much the better place to go for amusements. And we were able to buy whole strips of tickets at quite a reduced rate. So we'd spend the day riding on rides after taking the streetcar over there. At that time there was a streetcar going out to Jansen Beach. Parents would take us to the car line, and then we were supposed to be back at a given time. Of course, the teachers went with us, so we get back to the end of the car line out in East Portland, and parents would pick us up, take us home. In the summertime, we'd pick berries. There'd be a truck that would pick up all of the children, all of the berry pickers, early in the morning with their sack lunches, and take us to the berry fields. There we were supposed to pick berries and earn as much money as we could, and then be taken home about 3 in the afternoon. It was in February of 1938, when I was in 8th grade, that my brother Rollin was born. My mother called on me to help raise him, and of course I knew more about doing that than she did. I was an 8th grader, and I knew just about everything there was to know. It was when Rollin was just about a month old that the fire occurred. And this was started, or the fire started right in the light fixture, ceiling light fixture in his room, in the baby's room. It was evening, and Rollin had been put to bed. We were sitting in the living room when suddenly the lights all went out. I dashed out onto the back porch to see what happened to the fuses. And I said, "No, the light's on in the baby's room." And the fire was burning the ceiling. That's where the light was coming from. So my mother quickly carried Rollin's baby basket out of the room, and we proceeded to get hoses connected and start putting out the fire. Someone called the fire department, and by the time they found us and got back there, the fire was all out. They determined that the fire was caused by faulty wiring. And this was the house that this so-called electrician had built. Most of the damage resulting from the fire occurred in the attic. In one corner of my mother's metal trunk had been right above where the fire was, and a lot of the pictures that were in there were badly damaged. Graduation came, and then more berry picking, and then it was approaching fall and time to think about going to high school. Well, I wasn't interested in going to high school, which would be Gresham High. I wanted to go to Jefferson High, which was where Betty and Sherman and Clinton and Virginia had all gone. That was the only place that I could see to go to high school. And it meant that I would be living with my father part of the time at the greenhouse. When my mother approached the Troutdale School Board about helping out with bus fare, they at first were rather reluctant. They said that they would do that for students going to Benson Polytechnic, but not to Jefferson. My mother finally prevailed, and that meant that they furnished tickets for the bus for my trips out to Troutdale on the weekend. Life as a high school student didn't appeal to me very much. The one thing that made high school palatable was the fact that I was in Gleeman in my junior and senior years. In fact, in the second half of the senior year, I was in Glee Club, and that was wonderful. That was the only way to live. There were trips to downtown Portland to sing at some of the churches, and the big trip that we all look forward to and really got a lot of enjoyment from was the trip to Eugene, where we were in the finals for all of the Oregon a cappella choirs. And of course, our choir took top honors. I thought Mr. Hollinstead, our teacher, was the finest man there was. This was in the days when Hopkins Jenkins was principal of the high school, and Mr. Bosserman was vice principal. It just so happened that in my senior year, the girl from our high school, who was Rose Festival Princess, was chosen queen of the festival. Rose Festival Queen. This was quite an honor. So it really finished off the the whole 4 years of high school to a T. During this time, in 1940, my brother Curtis was born. And this meant that when my mother went to the hospital, I was left to take care of Rollin and to wash his diapers and fix his meals and pretty much take care of him on the weekends. Now, during the week, for the few days, the daughter, the Grinnell's daughter, whom I hadn't mentioned before, and whose name I can't remember, came down to help out. So I was able to continue to go to school during the week. There wasn't much socializing going on for me at high school because every day my father expected me to come home from school and help in the greenhouse. This I did, doing my homework in the evening after supper which I usually cooked for us. The last 2 summers of high school I spent working in a nursery. It was quite an experience for me to solicit my first job. Glenn drove me over to the nursery, which was in Fairview, which was about 5 miles west of Troutdale. He drove me over, and I got out of the car and walked up to the door of the office and walked in and said I was looking for a job. And they asked me if I had a strong back, and I said yes, I thought so. So they said, all right, report for work in the morning. I had bought a bicycle about a week before that, a bicycle with a metal basket on the front. And this was what I used to get to work. I'd pack a lunch the night before, and then I'd pedal that 5 miles over to Fairview and go to work. The job consisted of hoeing, and most of us used a short-handled hoe because we could get closer to our work and do a better job and faster job. And that's what working for the nursery was all about, was speed. Once in a while we'd make a little slip and bark the sapling that we were, from which we were eliminating the weeds. And what we agreed to tell ourselves among the crew was that we'd put a little nursery salve on that banged up bark, which was just a little mud or dirt from the ground, to cover up our transgressions. This was, if you'll pardon the expression, back-breaking work, but we all got wonderful suntans and were in good health. It was good exercise. bending over and hoeing and straightening up, bending over and hoeing and straightening up. We were all in first-class shape by the end of the summer. In good enough condition that when I went into the service a year later, I was able to handle the calisthenics and the physical tests that were given without a great deal of trouble. The fields that A. McGill and Son, nurserymen, owned and in which they had stock planted were scattered all over the area. And one in particular was on a plateau above where we lived. And I had left my bicycle at the main building, and they had taken us to this field in a truck. At the end of the day, I made sure that they were coming back to that field in the morning. He assured me they were. So I just walked home, down the hill, over the edge of the hill. And next morning came back up the same way, and there, sure enough, was the crew. So that was an interesting experience. Near the end of the second summer, we went in